So good afternoon, and thank you for choosing to spend an hour of your time with Stratford Hall this Easter Saturday. I am Dr. Gordon Blaine Steffey. I'm the Vice President of Research and Collections and the Director of the Jesse Ball DuPont Memorial Library here at Stratford Hall, which I joined in 2022 after 18 years at Randolph-Macon Women's College, now Randolph College in Lynchburg, Virginia, and there I held an endowed chair in religion and philosophy. And I'm currently working on two books, the first on Stratford Hall and the second on Dr. Arthur Lee, which brings us to today's topic, Rebel Abroad, a Stratford Subversive in the Heart of Empire, our commemoration of the 250th anniversary of Lexington and Concord. So let's begin. British papers listed Dr. Lee among the dozens of names of note who attended the Easter Monday Gala at the Lord Mayor of London's Mansion House on the 17th of April in 1775. Now, the Lord Mayor was popular opposition icon John Wilkes. He was a friend and ally of Dr. Arthur Lee, who years earlier befriended Wilkes at the King's Bench prison, where the future mayor was serving 22 months for seditious libel. Now, the papers noted that gala attendees danced minuets, alemans, cotillions, and country dances until 3 a.m. in the morning of the 18th. So, on April 19th, 1775, 250 years ago today, Dr. Lee was likely still recovering from a late night and what the papers described as, quote, the usual profusion of wine. So what Arthur didn't know is that on April 19th, his life, his prospects had changed forever, kind of like the light of the stars, which takes time to reach us. After the war, and with the advantage of hindsight, Arthur would call this moment the moment that London was, as he put it, unparadised for him. But he had 39 days of paradise remaining before the light arrived and changed everything. So I'm delighted to speak with you today on the 250th anniversary of Lexington and Concord about Arthur Lee, who was an under-recognized firebrand of the revolutionary generation of Stratford Lees. But first, I want to share with you a thought of John Adams. 15 years after Lexington and Concord, after the war. Now, Adams was sensitive to the story of the founding. He was very sensitive to the story of America, by which I mean that he cared very deeply about who and what were remembered, how they were remembered, and really he was concerned about how the story of America was being told around hearths and in schoolrooms. Already in 1790, Adams was uneasy with how America's story was shaping up, and he complained to a friend of his, Dr. Benjamin Rush. He said, quote, the history of our revolution will be one continued lie from one end to the other. Now that quote continues, the essence of the whole will be that Dr. Franklin's electrical rod smote the earth and outsprung General Washington, that Franklin electrified him with his rod, and thenceforward those two conducted all the policy negotiations, legislation, and war. Lie from one end to the other. Now, what Adams obviously means is that it's false to think that the founding of this nation was essentially the achievement of a few superheroes, giants, one of who could call lightning from the sky. If you watched the Franklin series on Apple TV+, you saw The Lie at work. The series pitched itself to viewers as the story of how Benjamin Franklin saved America. And if you listen carefully, you can hear John Adams kind of rolling in his grave. So already in 1790, Adams is worried about replacing history with mythology. Almost 30 years later now, and this is now the 10th of August, 1819, Adams is 84, and he's still correcting the record when he detects the lie at work. He'd been sent a copy of a commemorative address that was delivered to Congress on the 43rd anniversary of the founding by Richard Bland Lee, who was the younger brother of Light Horse Harry Lee of Stratford. And Richard Blaine Lee's commemorative address was essentially a retrospective tribute to the founders. But Adams was astonished to find that in this 15-page retrospective tribute, Richard Blaine Lee never once mentioned a Lee. So Adams corrected the lie by return post. This is what happens when you send a copy of your talk to a founder. They write back and they correct you. In his letter, Adams says, "Your modesty and delicacy have restrained you from doing justice to your own name. That band of brothers, intrepid and unchangeable, who, like the Greeks at Thermopylae, stood in the gap in defense of their country from the first glimmering of the revolution in the horizon through all its rising light to its perfect day." So band of brothers here refers to the Lee brothers, the sons of Thomas and Hannah Lee of Stratford, all of whom, by the way, were long dead, some 20-odd years. The last had died, and mostly forgotten. In his letter, Adams mentions 5 Stratford-raised Lee brothers: Thomas Ludwell, Richard Henry, Francis Lightfoot, William, and Arthur Lee. And to the invocation of those names, Adams adds a brief word of tribute recognizing their particular talent or contribution to the revolution, to the story of America. So, for example, of the most famous brother, Richard Henry Lee, Adams writes this: "Richard Henry Lee, whose merits are better known than acknowledged and need no illustration from me." That's it. That's all he says. Adams, and this, and by the way, the same is true for the other 3 brothers, but his note on Arthur is neither brief nor is it quite as aloof. Here's what he says about Arthur. "Arthur Lee, a man of whom I cannot think without emotion, a man too early in the service of his country to avoid making a multiplicity of enemies, too honest, upright, faithful, and intrepid to be popular, too often obliged by his principles and feelings to oppose Machiavellian intrigues, to avoid the destiny he suffered. This man never had justice done him by his country in his lifetime, and I fear he never will have by posterity. His reward cannot be in this world." There's simply no way to do justice to Arthur Lee in the time I'm allotted. And one of the things I like to say about that is that the best biography I know of Arthur Lee was written in 1976 by a man named A.R. Riggs, and it was called The 9 Lives of Arthur Lee, Patriot. I don't have time to do 9 lives today. But perhaps I can push back the forgetfulness of history for a few minutes and share with you a true story of Dr. Arthur Lee of Virginia, a story that is relevant to the 250th anniversary of Lexington and Concord. But first, a little background. Born at Stratford in 1740, in fact, he was probably the first Lee child of that generation born at Stratford, and he was reared there for the first 12 years of his life. He spent the better part of the next 25 years abroad, first at Eton College, acquiring a gentleman's education, followed by credentials in the practice of medicine from Edinburgh University, where he was awarded the first annual gold medal for the promotion of botany, and he was elected a fellow of the Royal Society on the strength of his laboratory experiments with the anti-malarial drug Peruvian bark, quinine. In March 1765, a freshly minted physician, Arthur expressed dread at the prospect of returning to Virginia, and he confided to his brother and mentor, Richard Henry Lee, that his, quote, extreme aversion to slavery, end quote, made homecoming unpalatable. In reply, and with the unpopular Stamp Act beginning to stir up the colonies, Richard Henry encouraged Arthur to remember his duty. Quote, "America has a parent's claim to her descendants and a right to insist that they shall not fix in any place where by so doing they may add strength to cruel and tyrannical oppression," end quote. So Arthur dutifully responded by returning to Virginia on July 4th of 1766, and he set up his medical practice in Williamsburg, which at that time was a rude backwater compared to London. nerve center of the empire, where Arthur had relatives and where he had rubbed elbows with the movers and shakers of Georgian England. So I want you to imagine his culture shock on settling in Williamsburg, its population fewer than 5,000, nearly half of whom were enslaved Africans and African Americans. Just by way of comparison, the population of London in Arthur's day approached 1 million. To Arthur, slavery was indefensible, and he said so in a 1767 article published under the pseudonym Philanthropos, lover of humankind, in the Virginia Gazette, where he called it a violation of justice and religion. And he observed, and I'm quoting him, "There is not in all history an instance in which every right of men is more flagrantly violated," end quote. Now, Arthur still held on to some problematic views of Anglo-American supremacy, but his views on what he called the inhuman traffic circulated among anti-slavery activists at home and abroad. But in short order, Arthur was heartsick for metropolitan London, and he did not find consolation, nor did he find any joy in the practice of medicine. It wasn't, I think, what he imagined, what he hoped. So in the late summer of 1768, having weathered just over 2 years in the colonies, 27-year-old Arthur Lee returned to London. But far from adding strength to cruel and tyrannical oppression, as Richard Henry put it, Arthur was keen to confront oppression from within the lion's den as an activist, as a writer. He proposed to collect and share political intelligence concerning the intrigues of the British ministry with American patriots back home, so that they could, as he put it, harmonize in one system of opposition. Like his brother, Arthur was really increasingly distressed by what he saw as British overreach in the colonies. From February to April 1768, he published essays under the pseudonym Monitor in support of American rights. And in one of those essays, Essay 10, he wrote famously, "To tyrants and to tyranny a foe, I will maintain my liberty at the hazard of my life." Now, I always like to say, I get it. I know that it's not quite as sexy as Patrick Henry's "Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death," which, St. John's and Richmond, etc. But I'll add that to tyrants and to tyranny a foe, I will maintain my liberty at the hazard of my life. It may not be quite as sexy, but it's no less expressive of serious intent. And it's also 7 years before Patrick Henry uttered his famous catchphrase. So alongside the impassioned pleas for unity in the colony, appeals to grassroots activism, and insistence on an American Bill of Rights, the Monitor letters proposed, interestingly, commercial resistance to the 1767 Townshend Acts, taxes on British imports, through the formation of associations pledged to buying American. Now, Arthur was reared in a family whose status and resources required political engagement. His forefathers and brothers and his foremothers, especially his mentor, Richard Henry Lee, were leaders in Virginia colony. So it comes as no shock that country medicine wasn't really a fit for him. He didn't want to sit on the sidelines dispensing medicines as momentous events unfolded around him and groups were contending over big ideas. I mean, he felt like he could add something to the moment. And so he set aside medicine. And in March of 1770, he enrolled as a law student at Lincoln's Inn, transferring to the Middle Temple in London, which you see pictured here. And he was called finally to the bar in March of 1775. And that is 1 month before the shot heard round the world. And this brings me to the story I want to tell you today about Dr. Arthur Lee, Esquire. So one of the hallmarks of our society is the astonishing speed at which information moves. But information velocity and management was also of critical concern to American radicals in the conflict with Great Britain. And that's what this story is about, a story in which Arthur is going to figure prominently. He's now settled back in London, and Arthur really is a critical piece on the game board here. Now, we all know that on April 19th, 1775, colonists in Massachusetts Bay exchanged fire with British troops on Lexington Green and on the North Bridge at Concord. Casualty lists reckoned around 275 odd British and 95 odd Americans killed. This is to say nothing of the wounded. And this is, generally referred to as the shot heard around the world. It's actually from an Emerson poem, which was specifically about the North Bridge at Concord, but we use the shot heard around the world to refer generally to the events of Lexington and Concord. Now, the big question, however, was who fired the shot heard around the world? Post writers spread the news immediately, and straight away there was disagreement on the facts. The first report appeared in the Loyalist Boston newsletter, which concluded its single paragraph on the event at Lexington and Concord this way, quote, "We're not able to collect anything confident or regular and cannot therefore with certainty give our readers any further account of this shocking introduction to all the miseries of a civil war." So there was enough rumor out there. It was unclear what exactly had happened. There was certainly a civil war happening, but who fired on whom, there was no clarity. On the 25th, the Essex Gazette, which you see on your screen, top left, reported that the troops of His Britannic Majesty commenced hostilities upon the people of this province. Okay, now the issue has been settled, at least in the Essex Gazette. They fired first. On May 3rd, the Massachusetts Spy, which you see, I believe, there in the lower right, exhorted Americans, forever bear in mind the Battle of Lexington, where British troops, unmolested and unprovoked, wantonly and in a most inhuman manner, fired upon and killed a number of our countrymen. By the way, I love the escalation in rhetoric from, the Essex Gazette to the Massachusetts Spy. I mean, this is kind of the revolutionary version of Remember the Alamo. So, but this kind of patriot spin that you see in the Gazette and then later in the Massachusetts Spy, that kind of patriot spin is prompting loyalists now on this side of the pond to begin to circulate their own red-coded versions of April 19th. And one of those kind of shrugs it off as an unfortunate affair. But in this case, one of the ones that you'll notice here, a broadside that was published in Boston in 1775, on your upper right, you'll notice that it says of an attack that happened on the 19th of April on His Majesty's troops, right? So there's a loyalist version, a red-coded version of events, right? The colonists attacked His Majesty's troops. So there's what happened at Lexington and Concord. And then there's the story about what happened at Lexington and Concord, and that's really the next phase of the action. This is a contest for the control of the narrative. Which story, whose story, is going to carry the day? Tension between the crown and its colonies was already burning white hot. There was a lot of water under the bridge. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Coercive Acts, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, and so on. So it was really a critical moment. Who is going to win the race to frame the other as the aggressor in Massachusetts? Now, the official redcoat version of April 19th was composed by military governor of Massachusetts Bay, General Thomas Gage, and it departed Marblehead on April 24th aboard the 200-ton brig Suki, which was also loaded with goods for the British markets. Now, Gage's initial assessment of the 19th was surprisingly understated. He's writing to the British Secretary of War, that's Lord Barrington. He says, "I have now nothing to trouble your lordship with, but of an affair that happened here on the 19th instance." Like I said, this is really understated, especially when you compare it to Patriot reporting. Gage is later going to change his tune on this, by the way. But despite his nonchalance, Gage understood that rebels might seek to leverage what happened, or a story about what happened, to rally support to the American cause. And so, before the Suki sets sail, laden with all these goods for British markets, laden with the official reports, the official British reports about what happened at Lexington and Concord, before it puts out to sea, he drafts a set of instructions to be executed by the captain of the outbound Suki once she puts out to sea. I have a copy of those orders for you, those instructions for you to look at. When the ship is under sail and so far out that there's no possibility of her returning, Captain Bishop, to examine every letter on board her, those directed for Doctors Franklin, Lee, Borland, Bolin in this case, to be sent to Boston. Any other suspicious letters to be put under cover to the Secretary of State and given to Lieutenant Nunn, Captain Bishop telling his lordship that he was directed in this critical juncture to send him the enclosed for his perusal, as they might contain some intelligence of the rebels here. Okay, so despite the tone of his reporting, Gage isn't unconcerned. He says in this critical juncture, but what he's asking for here specifically is he wants outgoing mail confiscated. And he specifies mail that's addressed to Benjamin Franklin, Dr. Arthur Lee, and William Bolin, who are the current deputy and past agents of the Massachusetts Bay, all of them at that time living in London. So 2 days after the Suki sails, and Suki sails on April 26th, the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, the chair of the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, whose name is Dr. Joseph Warren, who's going to die at Bunker Hill in June, Warren writes to the Massachusetts Bay agent in London, quote, "Our enemies, we are told, have dispatched to Great Britain a fallacious account of the tragedy they have begun." So the Massachusetts Bay Provincial Congress anticipated this tale of two stories. And only 3 days after the event, they appoint, and this is incredible to me, only 3 days after the event of Lexington and Concord, they appoint a subcommittee of 9 people to depose combatants and eyewitnesses at Lexington and Concord. And so this subcommittee interviews 97 people over 3 days, securing notarized statements sworn in good faith before a justice of the peace. They bundle these depositions together with the April 25th edition of the Essex Gazette, the one saying that the British commenced hostilities, and a letter that Warren pens to the British public. And in this letter that he writes, he frames April 19th as British payback for colonial noncompliance. And he warns the British public in very famous words, quote, "We determined to die or be free." So to this packet containing Warren's open letter, a copy of the Gazette, all the depositions, Warren also adds instructions for the agent representing Massachusetts Bay in London, and that's Benjamin Franklin. And in this letter, which you can see again on your screen, he writes, "Sir, the happiness of this colony in this day of unequaled distress is devolved on your hands. The contents of this packet will be our apology for troubling you with it. From these you will see how and by whom we are at last plunged into the horrors of a most unnatural war. Our enemies, we are told, have dispatched to Great Britain a fallacious account of the tragedy they've begun, but we most ardently wish that the several papers herewith enclosed may be immediately printed and dispersed through every town in England, and especially communicated to the Lord Mayor, Aldermen, and Common Council of the City of London." So this intelligence packet that Warren's talking about was put together in incredible haste. And by the 26th of April, a Salem merchant named Richard Darby Jr. had volunteered his own private schooner, the Quero, which was captained by his younger brother John, to carry the packet and no additional cargo to London. And so the Massachusetts Committee of Safety met on the 27th and they passed a resolution. And here's how that resolution read. Resolved that Captain Darby be directed, and he hereby is directed, to make for Dublin or any other good port in Ireland, and from thence to cross to Scotland or England and hasten to London. This direction is given so that he may escape all enemies that may be in the chops of the channel, to stop the communication of the provincial intelligence to the agent. He will forthwith deliver his papers to the agent on reaching London. So, with the intelligence packet aboard, Quero departs Salem 4 days behind the heavier Suki on the 3,230-mile crossing. So let me repeat that. You can see it on your screen. The Quero is 4 days behind the Suki. But Suki is heavier, it's laden with goods, and Captain Darby, importantly, ignores his instructions to harbor in Dublin, and he crosses to Scotland and makes his way overland to London. And he ignores those instructions. He says, I'm going to harbor instead at the Isle of Wight. I'm going to take the ferry to Southampton, and I'm going to hire a carriage 75 miles to London, which is what he did. He arrives in London on May 28th, and that's where a wrinkle emerges in the plan. And the wrinkle is simply stated, Dr. Franklin was not at home. Dr. Franklin had despaired of finding a diplomatic solution with the North Ministry in London, and he thought he'd reached the end of his diplomatic usefulness. So he decides to go home. He took ship for Philadelphia on March 20th, 1775. That's 1 month before the shot heard around the world. And so Franklin was somewhere in the Atlantic when the shots were fired. In any case, he wasn't in London to receive news of the violence at Lexington and Concord. He wasn't there to receive this intelligence packet. So Captain Darby places the intelligence packet into the ready hands of Franklin's junior associate and ally and correspondent of Sam Adams, and the deputy provincial agent for Massachusetts Bay since 1770, the 34-year-old doctor, now lawyer, Arthur Lee of Virginia. His 39 days were up. The light had arrived, and that's going to change his world forever. But cometh the hour, cometh the man. The packet was in Dr. Warren's instructions to be especially communicated to the Lord Mayor of London, who in 75 was John Wilkes. Now, Franklin's opinion of John Wilkes was, and I'm quoting Franklin, he wasn't worth a farthing. But Arthur had been a friend and political ally of Wilkes since 1768, when Wilkes was at the center of legal actions and public debates about civil liberties and parliamentary reforms in Britain. And Arthur was also an executive member of the Society for Supporters of the Bill of Rights, and this was a pro-Wilkes political action group that tied its reform agenda to the repeal of every colonial policy since 1763 that violated the constitutional principle of no taxation without representation. So in late 1773, Arthur, again, who was secretary of the Society for Supporters of the Bill of Rights, he mobilizes the society to help secure the appointment of American patriots Stephen Sayre and his own brother, William Lee, as co-sheriffs of London. And now, this is really, truly incredible. For 1774, both sheriffs of London were American patriots. All of the members of the Society for Supporters of the Bill of Rights, and all three Americans, with Arthur at the head, helped John Wilkes to win the 1774 election for Lord Mayor of London. Now, this is all part of Arthur's political strategy. And that strategy was to help opposition groups and radicals in London to see their own interests as tied to the interests of these distant, dissident Americans. Arthur's message to them was, what you're fighting for, we're fighting for, and so we fight with you here, side by side in the streets of London. So when Quero arrived from Salem with instructions to get the word out, especially via the Lord Mayor, Arthur was perfectly positioned to maximize the political and administrative apparatus of the city of London. As Arthur would later put it in his own unfinished memoir, in the field of politics, from the politician in the cider cellar to the peer in his palace, I had access and influence. At the Society of the Bill of Rights, the City of London, the East India House, and with opposition in both houses, I was of some consideration. And that's not bragging, that's just facts. So, Captain Darby entrusts the intelligence packet to Arthur, and he hightails it back to the Quero, dodging agents of the North Ministry who are trying to apprehend him. He gets back onto the Quero, and he sets its sails for home. Meanwhile, Arthur arranges for a special edition of the London Evening Post for May 29th of 1775 to break the news to the British public of what happened on April 19th. And it's going to feature Dr. Warren's letter to the British public, as well as the Essex Gazette story. You can see that here on your screen. It's called the London Evening Post Extraordinary. Extra, read all about it. Here's the extra. That evening, Arthur dined with Lord Mayor John Wilkes, who noted in his diary that he was always happy to help his American friend. Remember that. On May 30th, the Public Advertiser republishes the extra, though editors at the Public Advertiser prefaced it with this remark, quote, "We are desired by authority to request that the public would suspend their judgment on that event until they can be more authentically informed of the particulars." Right? So, by the way, I love that expression, we are desired by authority. I mean, authority presumably means the American Secretary, Lord Dartmouth, right? And Dartmouth is instructing the Advertiser, listen, we need to put the brakes on here, make sure that folks don't trust this verbatim. So Dartmouth then places a notice in the pro-ministry London Gazette to prevent this American story from picking up speed. So he puts a buffer in the Advertiser saying, you know, you'll be more authentically informed later. Then he places this notice in the pro-ministry London Gazette, and that one reads, and this was interesting, quote, "A report having been spread and an account having been printed and published of a skirmish between some of the people in the province of Massachusetts Bay and a detachment of His Majesty's troops, it is proper to inform the public that no advices have as yet been received in the American department of any such event." So, right, this is great. Dartmouth is advising the public that, you know, an official report is surely inbound, and it's going to cut through all the noise, all the rumor. It's going to settle the truth of the matter. We can't believe what we've seen in the papers. So on May 31st, Dr. Arthur Lee masterfully counters Dartmouth's insinuation of fake news. That's what Dartmouth is doing, right? This is fake news. He masterfully counters this by publishing a curated selection of depositions from Lexington and Concord, and he invites the British public to go and see for themselves, go judge for themselves. You see, remember that supper that he had with Lord Mayor Wilkes on the night of the 29th? During that supper, Arthur had placed the folio of depositions on reserve at Mansion House. And then he placed this notice in the paper. As a doubt of the authenticity of the account from Salem, touching an engagement between the King's troops and provincials in the Massachusetts Bay, may arise from a paragraph in the Gazette of this evening, I desire to inform all those who wish to see the original affidavits, which confirm the account, that they are deposited at the Mansion House with the Right Honorable the Lord Mayor for their inspection, Arthur Lee, agent for the House of Representatives of Massachusetts Bay. Right, this is so crisp, so elegant. There's nothing strident here. It's not tediously long. It's just checkmate. Beautiful. And pro-government writers were apoplectic, right? They couldn't do anything at this point. I mean, little more than really denounce Lee and Wilkes both as pestilent traitors, which they did. That same day, the former Massachusetts governor, controversial former Massachusetts governor Thomas Hutchinson, who was then in London, he wrote to Thomas Gage, quote, "The arrival of Captain Darby from Salem on the 28th with dispatches immediately published in the papers caused a general anxiety in the minds of all who wished the happiness of Britain and her colonies. It's unfortunate to have the first impression made from that quarter. It said your dispatches are on board Captain Brown," he means Bishop, "who sailed some days before Darby. I hope that they are at hand and will afford us some relief." In point of fact, they were not at hand. And Arthur made use of the lag to do what he did better than most: shape public opinion using the British instrument, the British press, as his instrument. And in the end, Arthur had 12 days to make hay before the Suki finally drags into Dover on to June 9th, the official report being given into the hands of Lord Dartmouth on June 10th. By the way, that day, so when the official report arrives, Hutchinson again writes in his diary, quote, the material difference, and he's talking about the difference between the rebel and redcoat versions, the material difference is that the inhabitants fired first. So during the 12 odd days between the arrival of the Cuero and the arrival of the Suki, Arthur Lee manages to turn the tide of what would have been a muted story of a skirmish, an insurrection in a remote province, into a tale of historic and heroic resistance to tyranny. Arthur barrages the papers with essays and editorials under several of his familiar and favorite pseudonyms. As memento, he encouraged Lord North to put a stop to, quote, the further effusion of the blood of our countrymen. As Raleigh, he praised Americans for squaring up to a contest that promised the rehabilitation of liberty in Great Britain itself. He published an anonymous pamphlet assigning blame for the rebellion to the government's love of absolute power. And as a Bostonian, he heckled Thomas Gage for his sluggish report on Lexington and Concord, remarking that the ministry was just too ashamed to admit it into the pro-ministry London Gazette. So he hammers the North Ministry for 12 days in a variety of voices, under a variety of pseudonyms. And in his characteristically restrained way, Lord Dartmouth observed that Lee's media bombardment, and I'm quoting him, had its effect. 10 years later, in March 1785, Arthur's going to write his friend John Adams, and he says to him at that time, quote, you are as well acquainted as I am how powerful a political instrument the press is. So since arriving in London, Arthur had become the leading voice for the American patriot cause among English radicals, the Whig opposition, and also among American expats. Under his own name, using this kind of bewildering variety of pseudonyms, some of which you've just heard, including CL, Monitor, Memento, a Bostonian, an old member of Parliament, Raleigh, Junius Americanus, and others. He kept American grievances in the frame for the literate British public. As a penman, propagandist, today we might say he was an influencer. Arthur was prolific, he was unrivaled. And what Arthur published in London papers was reprinted in other British papers and then ultimately reprinted in American papers. In March 1775, editors at the Virginia Gazette opined that the amiable Dr. Lee, admired by all for his literary abilities and excellent pieces in vindication of the colonies, shines conspicuous as one of the first patriots of the age. Funny story, as an aside, on July 8th of 1773, the entire front page of Rhine's Virginia Gazette and most of the second page was given to essays by Raleigh, Junius Americanus, and Philanthropus, all three of which were pseudonyms of Arthur Lee. Under the pseudonym Raleigh, he entreated Lord Dartmouth, I'm quoting him, having studied to provoke, let us now try to pacify, please the colonists. And yet, as Junius Americanus, he writes, quote, I'm very sorry to say that there's very little hope of any conciliatory plan being adopted. We often see men in their sober senses pursue measures which in contemplation we should imagine nothing less than madness could inspire. Some such fatality hangs over the American department and urges us to extremities. They persevere in a system which threatens infinite ill. So it's interesting, the pseudonyms Raleigh and Junius Americanus, they nicely represent an evolving conflict in Arthur. The conflict between, on the one hand, an Anglo-American who's perfectly at home in London, comfortable in London, right? And who's hoping for a diplomatic conciliation with England. And on the other hand, Junius, the zealot, who no longer sees any solution to American grievances apart from independence. And by the fall of 1775, Raleigh has finally given way to Junius Americanus. In December of that year, 1775, Arthur writes a letter to Sam Adams, and he's advocating independence. He's advocating a ban on hereditary titles. He's advocating a provision against any disarming laws. And he's also urging annual elections of officers for a new democratic government. we can say by the fall of 1775, Arthur's decided independence is all that's left. Now, Arthur's total contribution to the political literature of this era, say 1768 to 1776, may never be known. We have a fragmentary record. Arthur's use of pseudonymity, Arthur's use of anonymity make a final count very difficult. The late historian A.R. Riggs claimed, and quoting, something of his work probably appeared somewhere in all of the 91 months that he lived in London. Now that sounds like you wrote 91 pieces, but in fact, what we know, and I want to emphasize that this is just kind of a minimum. Between 1768 and 1776, Arthur Lee wrote a minimum of 170 essays, averaging 750 words in length, 9 pamphlets, one of which goes through 4 editions in Britain, 1 in America, 17 petitions, 50 personal letters that are being placed anonymously in colonial newspapers. And that's to say nothing, absolutely nothing of the fire hose of private correspondence, which is both personal and political, unsigned, disguised, encrypted, that's flowing into his networks in England and in the colonies. And that's including his family, his brothers. This was a dangerous business. What he was doing was dangerous. And I want you to remember Monitor 10, to tyrants and to tyranny a foe, I will maintain my liberty at the hazard of my life. He was risking his life for liberty, not from behind a tree, right? Not from among his compatriots, but from within the lion's den. Throughout 1775, Arthur is flooding the papers with pro-American propaganda, and he publishes a pamphlet that's really indicative of this deepening defiance of his. I'm quoting him now from this pamphlet. There is no magic in the word of Parliament which makes it necessarily compatible with freedom to be bound by its law in all cases whatsoever. It's the part that the people have in the Constitution of Parliament which renders it protective of liberty. Take away this intervention of the people, and Parliament will become only a plausible instrument of tyranny. End quote. Arthur was under surveillance. His outgoing and incoming mail were being intercepted. For those of you who listen to the Stratford Mail podcast, you'll know that there's a very charming letter where he complains very indignantly about his mail being intercepted. I mean, look, if I was the American secretary, Lord Germain at the time, I would have intercepted his mail. But Arthur writes this very just kind of, indignant, how dare you confiscate my mail? In spring of 1775, the British spy master Paul Wentworth offers Arthur 300 pounds sterling and political office for both him and Richard Henry, if he would only cease and desist. Effectively, Wentworth says, go on vacation. Arthur refuses these enticements. And that was a difficult enticement to refuse, by the way, because Arthur knew that his brother and mentor, Richard Henry Lee, wanted political office. He had long desired political office and had angled long and hard to get it and never had. Not what he wanted anyway. And here he was being offered that for his brother, and Arthur refuses the enticement. In August of 1775, George III issues the Proclamation of Rebellion, which charges all loyal subjects to denounce any person corresponding with and aiding or abetting American rebels and their traitorous designs. Tory enemies, Tory politicians, viewed Arthur really as the enemy within, and he was. And we see this in a late summer 1775 letter to the member for Parliament for Colchester, Charles Grey, who says, they might act as they pleased in America if we were united at home. But the American party, with Arthur Lee as a writer, have got possession of the newspapers. This Lee was bred up to physic, then turned lawyer, and now finishes as a rebel. He's probably the chief incendiary of Virginia, and he's on this side of the Atlantic. By late 1775, the Second Continental Congress had recognized the need to gather foreign intelligence and to cultivate foreign alliances in organized ways. And so to that end, they created on November 29th of 1775, what would ultimately be called the Committee of Secret Correspondence, which is the origin of our diplomatic service. The first letter that was posted by that committee on November 30th, the very next day, 1775, was a letter of recruitment to Arthur Lee. So though he had long acted as a propagandist for patriots, though he had long acted as a conduit of political intelligence from Britain to the colonies, he was now officially an intelligence contractor. He was now officially a spy. Was he any good? Consider this from John Adams in 1779, and John Adams is writing to the French foreign minister, Vergennes, who claim, and here's what Adams claims, that from 1770 to 77, quote, he communicated the most constant and certain intelligence which was received from any individual within my knowledge, end quote. So Arthur stays in England until late summer of 1776, by which time he had already solicited French aid for the Continental Army. Another consequence of his acquaintance with Lord Mayor Wilkes, his friendship with Lord Mayor Wilkes, was an encounter with the bon vivant, adventurer, playwright, Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais. Now, Arthur met Beaumarchais at the Lord Mayor's mansion house over at a party. Yet another gala. The Lord Mayor was given to parties. He met Beaumarchais there, and his impassioned advocacy for the American cause persuaded Beaumarchais to take the case to sympathetic French Foreign Minister Vergennes. And in February, Beaumarchais writes to Vergennes, who is eventually going to share this with King Louis XVI. Quote, this is a long quote, bear with me. The famous quarrel between America and England will soon divide the world and change the system of Europe. I am obliged to warn your majesty, the Americans must be assisted. Mr. Arthur Lee, a secret deputy from the colonies to London, quite discouraged by the inability of the efforts he has made through me with the French ministry to obtain assistance in the shape of powder and munitions of war, says to me now, quote, for the last time, is France absolutely decided to refuse to us all assistance and to become the victim of England and the fable of Europe through this incredible apathy? Obliged to give a positive answer, I wait for your reply in order to give my own. We offer France, in return for her assistance, a secret treaty of commerce, which will transfer to her for a certain number of years after the peace all the advantages by which we have for more than a century enriched England. End quote. So on June 10th of 1776, Beaumarchais was secretly granted 1 million livres for American aid, promise of arms, ammunition, other military hardware. Spain likewise contributes a tidy sum, and arrangements are made to ship this material through the French West Indies. And all of this happens before Silas Deane of Connecticut arrives in Paris with a congressional commission to purchase military supplies. All thanks to Arthur Lee. So by December 1776, Arthur received a new posting as co-commissioner to France with Silas Deane, with Benjamin Franklin, where he is going to be a signatory to the 1778 Treaty of Alliance that brings France decisively and openly into the war on the American side. On March 30th of 1778, Commissioners Benjamin Franklin, Silas Deane, Arthur Lee are received openly by Louis XVI as representatives of the new United States. By April, a French fleet under the command of Vice Admiral Comte d'Estaing sails from Toulon in support of Continental forces. So the American Commission succeeded in concluding a formal alliance despite significant internal discord. Arthur confided to his brothers and allies in Congress that he suspected Silas Deane of exploiting his public office in service of private interests. Fellow Commissioner Benjamin Franklin expressed more interest in the softer pleasures of Paris than in the hard evidence that Arthur presented, both of Deane's war profiteering and of Commission Secretary Dr. Edward Bancroft's espionage, about which Arthur was correct. Franklin and Deane never believed that Bancroft was a spy, and of course he turned out to be one of the biggest, one of the most important. Recalled by Congress to answer the charges that had been laid against him, Deane was unprepared. He was possibly unable to do so. And in retaliation, he publishes a baseless attack on Arthur Lee in the Pennsylvania Packet of December 5th, 1778. So you have this rift in the Overseas Commission to France that's magnifying, I mean, it's really magnifying the antagonism and the policy rift that already exists between the radical Leah Adams alliance in Congress and another minority faction in Congress that's spearheaded by financier Robert Morris. So I always like to say that, you know, the Lee Dean fallout is really a microcosm of the Lee Adams Morris fallout in Congress. And part of the problem with the fallout in Paris was that it was public, and this public discord in the diplomatic mission embarrassed Congress, right? I mean, here it is trying to, you know, set foot on the world stage as a new independent nation, and its commissioners are at each other's throats. And though Dean's defamations of Arthur, I mean, couldn't withstand and did not withstand examination, nevertheless, reputation was everything in the 18th century. And so Arthur's reputation took a tarnish that forever dimmed his political prospects and really soured the Lee family on politics for a time. On April 23rd of 1775, only a few days after shots fired at Lexington and Concord, about which he knew nothing yet, Arthur confided to his South Carolina compatriot Ralph Izard, "There's a silence in the New England provinces which argues an approaching storm." And a month later, Captain Darby turns up on his doorstep. Now, Arthur Lee wasn't born a radical. His education and his acquaintance shaped him to be something else, shaped him to be a gentleman agent of the empire, not a rebel, not a mouthpiece of a movement more than 3,000 miles away. The steps that he had to take to remake himself so as to serve his country meant that he was afterward an uneasy resident in his own country. Let me put that another way. He was built for a different world than the one he ultimately helped to create. As he would later confide to his unfinished memoir, "Could I be restored to that situation I enjoyed before the revolution, I might be happy." But sometimes he could be philosophical about all that he lost, both from the costly falling out with Franklin and Dean, and from his exile in the country he helped to found. And this is again from his unfinished memoir. "What then remains for me but to take the world as I find it, to remain in the midst of this odd chapter of accidents, to take the poet's advice," and here he slightly misquotes Horace, "seize the hour, trusting as little as possible in the next one." In truth, we refine too much in estimating human prospects and human happiness. We expect too much, we look too far. All this, I suppose, raises the question, did Arthur Lee regret his choices? And I'll close here. In correspondence with his nephew, Thomas Lee Shippen, the only son of Arthur's beloved sister, Alice, and this is sometime, I think, the year is 88 or 89, 2 years before Arthur's death, he says to Tommy, who's a young man looking to make a propitious entry into public life and being advised by his uncle, Arthur says to him, "I mark out to you the path I intended to pursue, in which 6 years' patient perseverance had advanced me hopefully, when my zeal for liberty and my country made me sacrifice all my prospects to embrace their perilous and doubtful cause. In return, I am now cast off with as much disgrace as they can fix upon me. Yet I cannot think, if I were again placed in the path of brilliant prospects, which I quitted, that I could hesitate to make the same sacrifice." His closing line in Latin is from the Roman poet Virgil from the Aeneid, "Yet shall a patriot's love prevail." The reference makes clear the real pain associated with sacrifice. That quote refers to a Roman Republican father who consents to the execution of his sons who were involved in a royalist conspiracy. Thank you so much for your time today. I have reached the end of my time. Just went over 5 minutes, but if you have some questions, please feel free to put them into the chat. I am willing to answer whatever it is I can. By the way, here's a lovely little, as you're thinking of questions, here's a lovely little quote from Samuel Adams. I love to give the last word to an Adams here, yet another Adams, where he says, the historian will in some future time draw forth the proofs of his patriotism, and unprejudiced posterity will acknowledge that Arthur Lee has borne a great share in defending and establishing the liberties of America. And again, there's a plug for the podcast. Please listen to the podcast Stratford Mail, which I do monthly. And also, if you're looking to pass many an hour deep in letters and papers of the Lee family and their allies and cronies, please feel free to browse the digital archive, the Lee Family Digital Archive, which is online. You can see it there. And great question, Rachel. How did Arthur meet his end? What about his personal relationships in London or here at home? Well, let me start with the first. And I thought about including this, but again, it's like the 9 lives of Arthur Lee. It's very difficult for me to do all the lives. And I only barely touched on his time in Paris. But as to his end, once he came back to the colonies for good, and that was 1780, he went through a couple state positions, public offices, had an appointment to the Board of Treasury. That was his last official posting, which concluded in 1789. And at that point, I mean, beginning about 1784, Arthur is really beginning, and you can see this in his diary, he's really beginning to say things to himself like, what am I going to do with my life? Which is funny. But, where am I going to settle down? And he has his land in a lot of different locations: Maine, Kentucky, Virginia, multiple parts of Virginia, Ohio, what we now think of as Ohio. And so it's really like he's figuring out, like, what am I going to do? And so ultimately he decides to return to Virginia. He buys a home in Urbana, Virginia, which is still standing. You can go and visit it. The owner of the home loves to talk about Arthur Lee and loves to invite people in to see the home of Arthur Lee. It's called Lansdowne in Urbana, and Arthur is buried there in the backyard. One of the last things some of the last letters that he sends to his friends are that he's really become a farmer, and he's planted lots of what would he say, black locust, willow, and roses on his property. And he says that his goal is to build a wilderness of sweets around his home. And sometime in 1792, he catches, the man wasn't sick very often, but he caught the sickness that would end in his death. As to his friends and relationships, he had no children that we know of. There are letters that you can read that he wrote to a mistress that he had while he lived in Paris. Her name was Mademoiselle Benoit. We don't know too much. We don't have much of that correspondence, but we also know that he wasn't terribly, he wasn't good with women. In fact, so much so that he was often using his sister Alice or his niece Nancy, Alice's daughter, to try to broker relationships for him, which almost never works when you're a grown man. But did he attend the inauguration of George Washington? Yes, he did. Yes, he did. But he spent also a significant amount of time in New York serving the Board of Treasury, which is where he was when Washington was inaugurated. And so he joined his brother, Richard Henry, who was representing in the Senate at the time. Well, thank you. If there are no more questions, I will return you to your afternoons and wish you all the joy of this beautiful day. And thank you for joining us, Stratford Hall, in the commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the events at Lexington Concord. Please come and visit us at Stratford Hall soon. I'm Dr. Gordon Blaine Steffey, and I hope to see you there. Thanks so much, everyone.